Hello, St. Mark's. It's Wednesday, August 19th. I'm Matt Wright, and this is St. Mark's at midweek. Today, we're going to talk to Tom Zoellner, St. Mark's member and author of the new book, Island on Fire, The Revolt That Ended Slavery in the British Empire. Tom is the author of Uranium, Train, and the Heartless Stone, and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, An Ordinary Man. He teaches at Chapman University and Dartmouth College and is the politics editor for the Los Angeles Review of Books. If you don't know him, you're going to get to know him now. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
We've missed August 1st, at least for our talk here. We're a couple of weeks past that, but maybe you could tell me a little bit about the significance of August 1st in your story.
Yeah. August 1st was a holiday that was more important than the 4th of July for African Americans. It was called Emancipation Day in the United States. And what emancipation meant was the day, August 1st, 1838, in which all enslaved people were freed throughout the British Caribbean. Britain had introduced slavery to its American colonies and introduced slavery to its Caribbean possessions, and they got ahead of the United States by more than 3 decades in abolishing the institution. And they did so because of a rebellion on the part of some enslaved people in Jamaica that convinced Parliament that this institution could no longer stand. And so the act passed Parliament on August 1st, 1833, and it took full effect also on August 1st in 1838. So this was a huge harbinger, of course, for abolitionists in the United States and enslaved people in the United States who really saw it as a beacon of hope.
Why have we never heard about August 1st Day?
Well, Juneteenth, which was the day of emancipation in East Texas after the Civil War in 1865, that began to take its place in the American consciousness as the day in which we celebrate freedom. And August 1st Day, which used to be celebrated with picnics and speeches and dances and even marches through the streets that bore a strange prefiguring of the Black Lives Matter movement, actually. Juneteenth began to take the place of August 1st Day, and August 1st Day began to fade away in importance. And it's still sort of remarked upon today, but it's not really celebrated anymore. The last real celebrations petered away in the 1920s. Okay. And I think it was because it was regarded as an overseas holiday and not an American holiday. But, when it was celebrated in America in the 19th century, it really was a day of hope that the United States would follow Britain's lead in getting rid of slavery.
Well, because we're so, I hate to say self-centered in America, but it's probably true. We have, to the extent we focus on enslavement, we think about our own history of enslavement of people. My wife and I were talking about this the other night, and she pointed out an article she'd read in National Geographic with a map showing the traffic of enslaved people coming from Africa into the United States and into other parts of the world. And in truth, the number of people coming into the United States was kind of a drop in the bucket comparatively. And I think we have very little idea of what was going on in the British colonies in places like Jamaica. You might describe the culture of enslavement and how many people were really enslaved down there, and who was really running the show.
You're absolutely right about that graphic, which shows the transatlantic slave trade. And the majority of it is going to the Caribbean and primarily Jamaica, which was the greatest slave depot, as it was called, where that didn't necessarily mean that those enslaved people were going to spend the rest of their lives in Jamaica. It was actually a trading port. So some of them eventually made their way to the United States, thanks to the trans-Caribbean trade to the American South. But the graphic still tells a loud truth that the trade to Jamaica was heavy as part of that famous triangle trade that most of us learned about in school. That is to say, manufactured goods to Africa, the western coast of Africa, kidnapped enslaved people to either the Caribbean or the US South, and then raw goods like sugar and cotton back to England for consumption there. And so, what we tend to forget here in the United States is that there was once a robust trade going on, not just across the Atlantic, but also between the United States and the Caribbean. This trade was in goods and human beings, but it was also in ideas. One of the things that American slaveholders feared the most was the idea that rebels could be hiding within the enslaved people that they were purchasing from the Caribbean, and that
Mhm.
they would see uprisings and revolts, such as those that would go on to topple slavery in the British Empire. Almost nothing worried American slave owners more than something like the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia in 1831.
Now, this is the Nat Turner Rebellion was happening prior to Samuel Sharpe's rebellion. Did it influence Sharpe's motivation to really stage this, what people called the Baptist War?
That is a really good observation, and I asked the same question because the Nat Turner Rebellion began in May of 1831, and Sam Sharpe's rebellion began on December 27th, 1831. And so the Nat Turner Rebellion got a lot of coverage in Jamaica. The newspapers certainly wrote about it, especially the more liberal publications. And I certainly searched the archives for many things, among them any evidence that Sam Sharpe had been encouraged by this. And it does not show up in any of the testimonies of enslaved people.
Okay.
It's not out of the question. I mean, certainly they knew about it. That's almost beyond dispute. Whether they, took some courage in it is a separate question for which there's no documentary evidence. But it doesn't mean that it didn't, in some way, let them know that such things were had a possibility of success.
Well, let's back up for just a second because we've introduced Sam Sharpe, and he's the major player, I think, in your book, and the focus of the story. But he was preceded by another woman, Elizabeth Hayrick. Describe how these two people came to be the center of your story.
Yeah, Elizabeth Hayrick was a white woman. She was the daughter of a stockings manufacturer in industrial Britain. And were she alive today, she would be at the front of every Black Lives Matter march. She was a radical for her time. She converted to Quakerism and immediately took on most of the social justice concerns of her day. She was into animal rights before that was even a thing. And she was also horrified by slavery and made the link convincingly that if ordinary Britons would only give up the consumption of sugar, if they would stop dumping the stuff into their tea and coffee and stop, making these elaborate cakes and so forth, that they would cut off the economic support for this venomous system. And she was actually enormously persuasive. She convinced, by some estimates, more than 250,000 people in Britain to give up sugar. And she provided a really strong challenge to many of the celebrated abolitionists of Britain, Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce. These guys get a lot of the glory in the textbooks, but they were advocates of a gradual approach. They wanted slavery to sort of die this eventual suffocation. Hayrick said, no, we're going to do it today. And there's some evidence that Samuel Sharpe really took some courage from this. That they, of course, never met, but he certainly read about her and read about that movement.
Now let's go to Samuel Sharpe. Describe his place in this story, really at the center of the story.
Yeah, he was a what was called a Baptist deacon. He was enslaved himself, but he was not working in the fields. under that crushing burden of labor. He was relatively privileged, if such a grotesque concept as being privileged as a enslaved person can be concocted. He had light labors. He was the possession of a lawyer who did not harshly punish him. And he was given some freedom to travel between sugar estates to teach Bible lessons. So he was an enslaved person who had the gift of literacy. And so he was able to read the Bible. And he was able to read some of the passages from it that were largely censored from Christian education in Jamaica. Those verses dealing with freedom, particularly. Some of Paul's statements about there's neither slave nor free. You couldn't really talk about this portion of the Bible in any sort of religious context in Jamaica because it was regarded as, too hot to handle. This idea that you'll know the truth and the truth shall make you free. That was also something that white missionaries and the African deacons were not allowed to preach. But Samuel Sharpe sort of did this quietly. And he began to fuse this biblical message of liberty with some of the news that he was reading from the newspapers that were tossed overboard from the ships at Montego Bay from Britain, where he read about people like Elizabeth Hayrick, where he probably read about the Nat Turner Rebellion, and where he began to concoct this message that wasn't true, but it was still energizing, that actually King William IV back in faraway London had issued this decree that slaves were hereby emancipated. That wasn't true, but Sam Sharpe spread it around and said, well, the only thing that's stopping us from being free is the slave owners of Jamaica are preventing us from learning this news. So all we got to do on the night of December 27th, right after Christmas, is just sit down and not work. He wanted it to be peaceful. But some of his followers did not take that part of it seriously, and they began burning down sugar estates. And then what happened was a harsh crackdown on the part of the white militia, and that's when the chaos started.
What was the upshot of this rebellion?
It made huge news back in Britain. This was the largest slave uprising that Jamaica had ever seen. It was enormously costly. It was embarrassing. And this happened to coincide with the reform movement in Britain to give more representation to the industrial cities. And the Methodists and the Baptists in those cities also were persuaded that slavery was an inhumane, evil institution, that this was economically just a disaster for Britain because, the military costs were outweighing whatever benefit they were getting from cheap sugar. And so the rough wheels of democracy actually were instrumental in crushing slavery. Parliament got rid of it.
Is this a story that could have happened without the influence of Christianity?
That is a great question. I, of course, am a parishioner at St. Mark's, and I am a believing Christian. But I set out to write this book, without any sort of faith-based agenda. I didn't want to sort of write propaganda for Christianity. I approached it as a secular historian. The cards were going to fall where they fell. But this is a case where history really bears out that Christianity and its theology of liberation really made this rebellion possible and made freedom possible.
How is this rebellion and how has Samuel Sharpe influenced activists who followed in his footsteps? There must be parallels to Martin Luther King or Gandhi and others.
100%. What's remarkable about this is that the British, of course, tried to erase his memory. A person like Samuel Sharpe was not regarded as any sort of hero. In fact, he went to a criminal's death on the gallows. And, like I said, this was embarrassing for Britain. So he was not celebrated. And, this was a part of hidden island history for many, many years, up until the 1970s, when the independent government of Jamaica, resurrected him and really began to emphasize him as a national hero. But as you say, what was remarkable about Sam Sharpe is he pioneered so many methods of resistance that would later be adopted by Gandhi, by Martin Luther King, by the French resistors to the Nazis, um, by even the Irish Republican Army. And what we can, it's not as though they were reading about Samuel Sharpe, unfortunately. I wish they had been, but what this seems to indicate is that the methods that, an enslaved person in a remote part of a Caribbean island was able to sort of develop these really effective methods of resistance, spoke to me that these methods of resistance, are somehow universal, that they are latent within nature in some ways.
How did you find Samuel Sharpe? What brought the two of you together?
Well, like I say, he's not unknown. This is not a case where I heroically went to the archives and found this. No. I mean, Samuel Sharpe is well known in Jamaica. He's certainly mentioned and discussed at some length in Caribbean histories. He is not terribly well known in the United States. I happened across the story when I was trying to develop a book just about sugar. But that project never came together. But what did come together was a close-in look at this one incident in Caribbean history that I don't think, well, first of all, no one had really done a day-by-day account of it, had zeroed in on what happened, in a sequential fashion. And there seemed room to write that book, as well as to maybe write to a broader American audience about this significant figure in Caribbean history that really ought to be better known.
As we look forward into this chaotic election period and with so much chaos in our culture and the importance of resistance, I think, becoming greater in our lives as Americans, what can we take from this rebellion, this form of resistance, and Samuel Sharpe? What can we take directly from him that we might now credit to a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi?
He showed remarkable determination and strength, but he also showed remarkable restraint. While at least 600 enslaved people were executed or murdered during this rebellion, only a tiny number of white people died. The conventional number is 14, but I found evidence that even that's exaggerated, that the true number is closer to 2. So to contrast the unimaginable brutality of slavery, and during the 5 weeks of the rebellion, terrible revenge could have been taken by those who had every reason to want revenge, but they did not. They were, despite the burning of the plantations, were largely true to Samuel Sharpe's orders not to hurt anybody. And this is incredibly inspirational. For me, it reminded me a lot of James Baldwin and what he said in Notes of a Native Son, this really haunting question, which is, how do you maintain a passion against injustice while at the same time refusing to hate those who are doing the oppressing? There's a lot of hatred and anger out there in the United States, and I'm guilty of that myself sometimes when it comes to the outrages of this administration. But what's helpful to keep in mind is that giving yourself over to hatred is, of course, unbiblical, but it's also, in the end, ineffective.
Tom Zoellner is the author of Island on Fire, The Revolt That Ended Slavery in the British Empire. It's published by Harvard University Press. Tom, thanks for spending a few minutes with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this edition of St. Mark's at Midweek. Thanks to our associate producers Emily Wright and Lucy Grindon. Another update from St. Mark's next Wednesday, and our regular worship podcast on Sunday, also live on Zoom. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and be good to each other. I'm Matt Wright.